Hello everyone, welcome back to Tokyo on Fire. Today is June 9th, 2016. On Monday, after 6 days of wandering the woods, a 7-year-old boy was discovered. This is pretty big news here in Japan. There are lots of bears roaming in the forests of Hokkaido. Apparently the parents were disciplining the child. This is kind of a strange thing to have happened. It created a big controversy here. Actually, a lot of people just gave up on the kid. 6 days, they thought he was a goner.
Well, the story ended up a much happier story than anyone could have possibly imagined. After the child disappeared, after being left in the forest by his parents as a disciplinary measure.
Well, he was throwing rocks or something.
He was being a bad boy, but when they left him behind, they drove off. When they came back, he was gone. Everyone thought that this was going to be a story that ends up in tragedy, or possibly that this was in fact a cover-up for homicide.
Right.
Anyway, but it turned out it was a miraculous story with this young man finding a place to sleep, which was an abandoned SDF training area. Well, it's not abandoned, it was just not occupied at the time he was there. So he had running water that was clean water, and he just lived there without food for 6 days.
He wandered quite a distance, though, didn't he?
Yeah, it's quite a distance possibly, but it was clearly outside the zone where they thought they would find him, and that was the issue. There were hundreds of searchers.
Hundreds of people mobilized. Even the SDF, the Self-Defense Forces, contributed a contingent of soldiers there to look through the area. They couldn't find him.
Yeah, and they managed to miss in their own training area finding him when they had actually had people going through that area during the time he was there. Nevertheless, he was found by accident by someone who found a door ajar that should not have been open, and then found him there and asked him, "Are you the child that's been missing?" My name is, and it all worked out.
Yeah, is your name Tanaoka?
Yeah,
Yes.
and it all worked out.
Right.
Now, but the issue though is the debate about discipline and children that has broken out, and there are two sides. There is a strong wish to have children that are well disciplined, and many people do indeed just walk away from their kids, and the child is screaming, and the parent just walks away, and then comes up back and grabs the child, or the child follows and feels contrite, and everything works out. So there is that side of it, but also there are a lot of people who say, what kind of parents are these, and what's going to happen? What is the government going to do when faced with this issue? Yes, they can temporarily and did temporarily hold on to the child in a hospital environment, but he's been released.
Services.
Yeah,
right.
he's been released to his family and has gone home.
Right. His father publicly apologized in a press briefing.
Yes, well, for all the trouble that he caused the school and everyone else, I think he needs to talk apologetically to his son.
Well, I think he did. His son accepted graciously.
I think it's going to be a long-term conversation in that family.
Right.
But nevertheless, when people behave in this manner, what is the responsibility of the state? What is the responsibility of the people who finally find the children? Where do you draw the line? And that is an interesting debate that's probably going to go on for some time. The story ended up happily, which is wonderful, which means that the debate can now shift to, it could have been a disaster, and there are probably cases of missing children who actually were abandoned by their parents, and that this is going to open, in some places, cans of worms, or cases that were otherwise cold. Nevertheless, as my personal sense of this is, will it change Japanese society? Maybe. Because this has been it was a national obsession for the week that he was gone.
It really was. I mean, people really just jumped to the most negative conclusion, and probably they did that because every once in a while we hear about just horrendous crime reports of people getting killed, chopped up. They find pieces in a suitcase, and it's a mother or a father, and it's just really some crazy things going on.
Also, there has been a long-term focus increasingly on child abuse and child neglect. And the role of the state let's say even 20 years ago, was much more
Hands off.
hands off.
Right.
Children are the responsibility of the parents. The parents have autonomy. Much more nowadays, the responsibility to protect that teachers have, daycare center workers have, that
really
that
increased,
bureaucrats have inside ward offices, etc.
You're right.
That has burgeoned, and it's one of the things that now bureaucrats really pay attention to. It's a part of a really a major shift that's happened, really accelerated over the last decade. And it's not just about child abuse, it's about stalking, whereas in the past the police said, well, just tell the guy to leave you alone.
Right.
Now they get really, really involved into these issues. And this case was one of these situations where there were no previous incidents and there was nothing to judge the parents on as being abusive, but there was this extraordinary event.
Right.
And it's going to lead to some questions about, okay, what's prosecutable, what should be grounds for conduct that is unforgivable, for parents to do. And that's going to be an interesting debate inside this larger societal movement, which is getting the state more and more involved inside the family.
One of the reasons why I want to talk about this on Tokyo on Fire is because of the kind of implications of corporal punishment. And it used to be in Japan, not in the so distant past, that you would see corporal punishment being applied by teachers to students or by parents, a slap on the head or a smack or something like that. And you see very, very little of that these days. And it probably is because, I don't know, maybe the preciousness of children has really risen in value. And maybe it is just this application in the absence of corporal punishment. Let's use something psychological. I'm going to leave you by the side of the road and there are bears in the woods and you better do what I tell you to do. And it's reflected somehow in larger corporate society where ijime, the punishment of colleagues through psychological means.
Isolation and being left alone.
That's right. And that seems to be the more prominent tool for coercing people to do what you want them to do rather than through some sort of physical means.
Yeah, it's very true that the right of physical punishment has been diminishing. It's certainly no longer a right, except in some school districts, that there can be physical punishment. And that basically due to sports clubs in high schools and middle schools where coaches were using physical punishment in order to toughen up their players, and that became unacceptable over the last 2 decades.
Well, there have been some really big cases where Olympic athletes have actually, in coaching their teams, have been...
The women's judo team, that was a classic case of where it is a combat sport, and yet, no, you went too far.
Right.
And you're right, this alternate form of punishment, rather than physical striking, isolation, is probably seen as, well, what can I do? It's a part of, I've lost that part of the toolbox.
What else? What's in
the
bag?
What else can I do?
Yeah.
And that is going to be part of the discussion. What can parents do to discipline unruly children? Because unruly children have to be disciplined in some way. It's for their good and it's for the good of society. And parents are feeling caught, in this decision. I can't strike my child because everybody's going to think I'm an abusive parent. But if I let the child just go wild, they'll think I'm not a parent at all.
Right. Well, doesn't this kind of bleed out into other parts of society? For example, toughening up the SDF so that they can be a Marine Expeditionary Force, for example, or doing push-ups and pull-ups and crawling through the jungle and recapturing that fighting spirit that the Japanese were so famous for, that's been pretty much extinguished from basically the fighting society. But also more to the point, if you've lived in Japan any length of time, you always are so curious that you never see fights, you never see fisticuffs, but you do see people get into arguments and they rub up against each other, but they don't apply physical violence. And it seems to be that is the one mortal sin. If you get into a fight and actually you do lay a hand on somebody, by definition, you are the guilty party.
That's very true, and it's certainly true in the way that the police practice the application of their laws. And that if you get to the level of physical violence, it doesn't matter whose fault it was, it doesn't matter who started it or any of that. It's where did the violence come from? And if you use violence, you're out of bounds. Again, that applies to this situation where the parents, in trying to discipline or in try to teach a lesson, drove away and left him behind instead of smacking him around until he stopped. Well, it's a very tough line. It's going to be a big discussion here, but we're having it in a very positive light.
Sure.
It turned out okay.
Is this some suggestion? I mean, people have said this before, that Japan is something of a nanny state. I mean, the parents and the way they run corporations, the way they apply discipline, the way they get things done internally is basically dictated by, a hands-off but psychological approach.
I can't really say that has anything to do with the present situation. All I know is that everyone is relieved. The general sense throughout the society is relief, but there is a huge divide between, are the parents utterly reprehensible, or are they just lucky?
A 7-year-old boy was found after 6 days of wandering in the forest in Hokkaido. The national debate on toughening up kids and disciplining them continues. We'll continue to watch this. You should too.